goof. Exhibit 1. So I was on the OpenAI GPT beta back in May 2021. For some perspective, this is like 18 months before ChatGPT was a thing. And this is not a, look, I was using it before it was cool story. It's kind of the opposite. Because I used to give customer talks on what was new in the world of AI, and I would tell them about GPT, and people could not care less. And the typical response was, okay, so you're saying there's some new groovy AI that can generate some text. Big deal. Whatever will they think of next? And the thing is, I couldn't get people to care about it just because I was making the kind of classic educator blunder that I was telling people about GPT and LLMs, and I was teaching them about transformer architectures. And I was kind of doing all these details about the inner workings of AI without really showing what it did. And I was used to teaching developers and data scientists. I wasn't showing what it could do. So these days I work for Accenture, and to be clear, what I'm about to do in this talk is not Accenture's official policy, just a few of the things I've learned. They might agree with me, they might not, I didn't ask. But I mention it because, as we said, we train hundreds of thousands of people on emerging tech and AI, and I see a lot of organizations and a lot of people, just individuals, making the same mistakes with this. This idea that to be better at AI, I need to know more about it. So let's say you begin at the beginning and you decide to go to a college or a university or an ed tech site and find some introduction to AI course. And what are you going to get? I could basically get the output of it from a pretty simple LLM. Here's the history of AI. We're going to talk about Alan Turing, and we'll talk about ELIZA, and we'll move through perceptrons, and then we're going to talk about transformers. We'll talk about artificial intelligence versus machine learning versus deep learning. We'll maybe cover encoders versus decoders. You might get into what gradient descent is, and here's a diagram of how a neural network works. And none of it makes anybody any better at actually using this stuff. The thing is, I'm not saying that this knowledge is worthless. I've done and made a lot of this kind of material, but there's a big difference between understanding how AI works and knowing how to work with it, and we've been massively overinvesting in the first one. Now, this as a problem isn't new to AI. We've done it before. So I'm a gentleman of a certain vintage. And those of you in the room who might remember like the mid-90s when the web was first a thing, if you wanted to go learn about the World Wide Web, you would go to a bookstore and you'd buy one of these ridiculous 1,500-page tomes on how to do it, and usually including like 200 pages of how TCP/IP worked and the hypertext transfer protocol and all those long explanations, and there were dozens of books like this. Now, are there people who need to know about TCP/IP? Sure, but not a lot of them. And you certainly didn't need to know about it in order to use the web. All this extra stuff wasn't just useless, it actually got in the way. People gave up, they stopped reading. Most of these books were never read. But it was almost this consensual hallucination that, oh no, you have to teach people about this stuff in order to be any good at it. And I think we're making the same mistake with AI. So if I summarize that as too much wasted effort on learning the wrong things, the problem is when this kind of problem is perceived as a lack of technical knowledge, you also get companies who focus on, oh, we need to upskill all our developers into becoming AI engineers. That was kind of an issue for a couple of years, and that's no, you probably don't. You need more general capability rather than more specific deep skills on this. And when you look at what most people are doing with these tools, it's kind of disappointing. You know, places roll out Enterprise GPT or Gemini or Claude or what Copilot, another thing, and then they look at what 90% of enterprise AI users are doing, and it's basically rephrase this email, summarize this document, make this thing sound more professional. And they aren't useless, but they're kind of trivial. You've got the most powerful technology we've ever had on our desktops, and we're using it like a thesaurus. So, excuse me. Back out there. I know it's too much. I think just this is the, oh, you've seen my master look? There we go. Sorry, folks. Shifting. I'm holding a microphone and a remote in this at the same time. I'm not my stuff good. Yeah, thank you. Because I want to talk the garbage use cases. The thing is, the AI vendors themselves, can you actually hear me off the back fine? I'm not getting the microphone. Okay,
Yeah.
we're good. The AI vendors themselves were kind of guilty as anybody about this, because for the longest time, if you were using ChatGPT, the things that you begin with, yeah, what's up?
I'm recording you on that.
Okay.
Oh, that's what.
Fair enough.
Forgot. Fair enough.
All right.
All right, Mom.
The vendors themselves, for the longest time, you use ChatGPT, and what you get to begin with is these really trivial examples like, oh, what can you use it for? Brainstorm names for a non-alcoholic cocktail. Trade a workout plan. Tell me a fun fact about the Roman Empire. Well, the thing is, and my favorite used to be, give me a story about Sharky, the toothbrushing shark superhero. You start onboarding people into your technology product like this, and then later you can't give me a shocked Pikachu face, so people are actually surprised that, oh, what do you mean they can't come up with a meaningful agentic goal? It's no real surprise in this. So, here's the thing. Even what you get these days, the more advanced use cases, particularly something that's described as agentic, is still garbage, because it looks something like this. We're going to research company X, and they're a mid-sized healthcare company. You're going to analyze their earnings reports. You're going to identify the top 3 challenges. You're going to build a deck on a compelling narrative arc. You're going to include talking points so we can go into them and tell them how we're going to solve their problems. This is a pretty classic kind of advanced use case now. It's supposed to be more realistic. So off the AI goes, and you watch it spin away, and it starts to do all the searching in the background. And everybody kind of goes, oh, that's cool, it creates the artifacts, it does this stuff. Problem is, everybody's kind of feeling this little bit of an itch, going, yeah, but if everybody can do this in the next few minutes, whatever company you're in, you can just tell it, build me a McKinsey-style slide deck, and you can get one. Then what? What do you do next? What's your value? Where's your kind of insight into all of this? You don't have any of that stuff. Now, the thing is, there are some of these use cases that are actually surprisingly useful. If I work with co-work, you'll forgive me, I tape some of these things. I never like to rely on conference Wi-Fi. Claude Co-work will give you a bunch of examples, just like all of them. Stuff like build a data dashboard, prioritize my inbox, draft an email, and they're all fine. But there's one of these that I think is tremendously underappreciated in terms of a agentic use case, and it's this one. Organize my files. Now, bear with me, this sounds pretty basic, and it isn't. It's way more useful than most people think. Because the fact is, what you can do with this, you can point Claude to, say, a folder. So I've got a messy desktop. It's full of files and spreadsheets and documents and expense reports. Now, one of the things I do, I take a lot of screenshots, because when I'm creating courses, I'm screenshotting websites, and I'm screenshotting white papers, and I'm screenshotting user interfaces, and all of this stuff. Now, if you sat somebody down and said, okay, you're going to tell AI to organize this stuff, what's it going to do? Most people would say something like, well, first off, it's probably going to gather all your spreadsheets and put them in a folder called spreadsheets, and gather all your Word documents and put them in a folder called documents, and it's going to gather your screenshots and put them in a folder called screenshots. And no, that's not what it does. What Claude will first do is go, I'm going to actually look at each one of them. I'm going to do image recognition and find out what that screenshot represents and what they contain. Then we'll go through that and say, with my case there, go, oh, I recognize that a bunch of these, 7 different screenshots, were things you took of white papers on the concept of human in the loop. So I'm going to name them that. I'm going to put them in a folder. I'm going to categorize them and start tagging them. And then it'll do that with, excuse me, folks, just getting This is going to go up the laptop in a moment here. And the remote is giving me no issues. So it's going to give me these things. If I go back, it's going to recognize a bunch of them were also agent platforms. It was things like the homepage of Lovable and the homepage of Copilot Studio and all of that. And it's going to then tag them, categorize them, move them into folders, and present that. Now, the thing is, you show this to someone, and typically the response is, oh, that's pretty cool. I didn't think it was going to do that. And that little tag of, oh, I didn't think it was going to do that, is very helpful when you're trying to illustrate this stuff. And it kind of leads to this point of being prepared to be surprised. That if you're working with agentic AI, you kind of need to leave some room for it to do stuff that makes you go, oh, I didn't think it was going to do that. You hope that most of the time you are pleasantly surprised. Occasionally it's unpleasantly surprised, but you need to leave room for it to be able to do it. What that means, though, is you need to first focus on the idea of goals, not steps. Now, this sounds kind of like a whatever, goal-directed AI, I get it. But if we take this idea that if you said, organize my files, it would be very easy to begin with a prompt like this. Go through every file in this folder. If it's a screenshot, move it to a subfolder called screenshot. If it's a PDF, put it to something called documents, yada, 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 yada. This is not actually a bad prompt. It's very constrained. It's very particular. This is the kind of prompt I will typically get from a lot of developers, because they're very habituated to thinking here that aren't work-related. I want this organized in a way that makes it easy for me to find reference material, and I don't need to huge implements. This is actually a longer prompt than the first one, but there's nothing about the process. This is all about the goals. This is all about context. It's what do I want. It is more context. It is not more instructions. And that's kind of what I mean about this idea. If you give it no leeway, you get no ability to be surprised at any of this stuff. We go back to goals, not steps. But the next thing is, even though you can get that stuff, you can get this unexpected behavior, which you hope to get. Because I'm going to argue if you're not being surprised by AI on a weekly basis, and I don't mean really being too prescriptive on this. The next thing I want to talk about is kind of using AI to do something you wouldn't do before, you couldn't do before. And I actually include that previous example. Let's say, for example, tagging 200 screenshots. I didn't just save time on that. That was something I never would have done. Oh, you might say, well, you could have done it. Yeah, technically, I could say it's not about doing things you couldn't do. Two things you couldn't do. I wouldn't have manually tagged 200 screenshots for my stuff. Okay. But in addition to that, I do actually want to step forward into the idea of using it to do things you couldn't do before. Because a lot of people get this mistake of thinking of AI as primarily an automation tool. It's going to allow us to do the same things we were doing, but quicker and more automatically. But still fundamentally the same thing. Now, an example of this. So I make content on teaching tech topics. And let's face it, a lot of that is pretty dull. A couple of weeks ago, well, let's say a couple of months ago, I was asked to make a topic to explain a little issue in cybersecurity called zero trust. Now, there's a very common analogy that people make when they talk about zero trust. And it's the idea of old school computer security being like castle and moat. Now, this is how it's usually taught. You make the analogy by finding some piece of crappy clip art, and you do that. And it's all very dull. And I thought, well, the analogy is actually pretty good. So AI video is getting kind of good these days. Is there a way I could use AI-generated video and make this stuff a little more compelling, a little more engaging? And I'll make you sit through it. It's about 40 seconds. It won't take too long. You see, in the past, network security was kind of like a
Security comes from our thick walls and impressive gates.
But the thing is, once you're through the gates, you were in, and everything inside was accessible. When the only security is outward facing, then all somebody needs is a back door, a tunnel, a crack in the wall, any method we could use use to bypass that security.
All we need is one way.
And the entire system is vulnerable because there's no security running on the inside. But zero trust treats systems more like a modern hotel. You check in, you prove who you are, and you get a key. But it isn't a master key. Your key card will get you to your room and only your room. All right, so hopefully you get the point. The idea there wasn't, okay, am I now replacing a film crew, including people out of work who are doing visual effects? No, I never had the option to do this before. I never had a budget, I didn't have a film crew, but could I actually use AI to make stuff that's a bit more engaging, a bit more interesting? Well, yeah, I think so. I think it works. And that's kind of what I mean about how could you use AI to do something that you couldn't do before. Additionally, anderen Sprache sagen. そして後にはその言葉を別の言語で言えるようになったんです。और बाद में मैं उन्हीं शब्दों को किसी दूसरी भाषा में AI that everybody knew about. People knew, well, I can do speech to text. No big deal. They know I can do text to speech. Everybody knows you can have a little bit of text and turn it into a voice, and you can clone the voice. People know that AI does language translation. People know that AI can manipulate video, but then you put them together, and it's like, oh, we got a really cool example. I can just kind of do inline video translation of all my stuff. Again, something that in the past, I generally didn't ever have my videos translated because it was too expensive and just not worth doing for stuff that might only have a 6-month lifespan. But this is what I mean about stuff that's actually useful to do, that's something we couldn't have done before. Now, what this often leads to people is, well, but how do I know if I'm picking the right one? I could do HeyGen, I could do 11 Labs. Should I be doing Copilot or Claude Cowork, or should I be committing to OpenAI and the OpenAI ecosystem? And it really doesn't matter at the moment. I mean, the landscape is bizarre. I mean, those of you who try and keep up with it, this is the most recent list from Andreessen Horowitz, who do the top 50 Gen AI web products by monthly visits. Bear in mind, I am up to my eyeballs in AI, and every time I look at this list, there's a bunch of things I'm like, I've never even heard of that one. I don't know what that one is. And nobody I know would tell me that they're actually up to date on all of this and completely up with what's going on in the marketplace. There's just too much stuff. So the other part of this is people often kind of, particularly technical folks for some reason, get a bit too worried about committing to one product or one framework or one structure, because it kind of feels like the old school. I've got to make the choice of if I'm using .NET or Ruby on Rails or name your own favorite technology, and it really doesn't matter. The general thought process that you need to learn here is completely transferable. There's really much less lock-in on any of this stuff than people were worried about. The important part is you're keeping yourself in this. Now, a lot of people who work with AI, you hear this term human in the loop. And it's actually a weird one. It's kind of stranger than it sounds because, first off, you'll see it in a lot of research papers. People talk about human in the loop, often abbreviated to HITL. And usually when you see it in a research paper, it's talking about the training mechanism of AI and how these things are actually wired up and evaluated and all of that stuff. But these days, you also find it in a lot more kind of casual references of just on websites and business articles and just kind of all over the place. It's being used in a much more generic sense of, oh yeah, sure, we're building AI systems, but we need to, we're always bringing a human in the loop in to review the results. And that's the part where you really need to be careful because it kind of suggests this idea that you're going to build an AI system that is going to do all the research, it's going to crunch all the numbers, it's going to come up with suggestions, and then at some point, you will bring a warm fleshback body into this who gets to say yes or no. They get to do thumbs up or thumbs down, and that's about it. Which, in a sense, there's no agency there. It's kind of like saying, well, the human is basically reduced to, I'm going to wait for a bunch of stuff from AI to come out, I'm going to take a look at it, and is this worthwhile or not? And there's a real problem with this. I don't just mean the kind of impact of late-stage capitalism, but the issue that people aren't very good at it. And as an example, if I kind of make the analogy to your spam folder, as most people know, you've got little bits of AI continually working on your incoming email and deciding this is probably spam, this probably isn't spam, and categorizing that. But you get to be the human in the loop. You get to say, you're wrong about this, or you're right about this, and it's fine. And the thing is, it's not a big deal if you don't do it. If you don't actually choose to get involved, this stuff's going to go away eventually, whether you interact with it or not. That's one of the downsides of any kind of passive human in the loop interaction, is just people don't do it. They just don't do very much of it. But the flip side is, even if you get people who are forced to review things, there's a growing amount of study about this idea called automation bias. And what it basically tells us is people get worse over time at doing this. They don't get better at evaluating AI results. They get worse. And the longer they work with a particular AI, the worse they get. An example then, even things like the user interface matters. Let's say you've got an AI that will generate 4 options. I'm going to use design here, but it could be text options, it could be suggestions. And the AI presents this to you. That's one thing. They've done studies now that if the AI appears to recommend one of the options, even if the recommendation is random, people are more inclined to go, yeah, that's probably one. And the longer they work with that system, the more likely they are to choose that. And I even find that myself, and like, when I'm working with even Claude these days, and it kind of gives me 3 options, and then tells me, I really think number 1 is the best one, it's kind of hard not to go, yeah, you're right, actually, it is. It's very easy to fall into it. It seems to be kind of a cognitive process in doing this. So, the alternative on this is, what are your options? Okay, this sounds like a little cutesy cute phrase, but we talk at Accenture a little bit about the human and the lead idea, and it's not meant to be just a cute phrase, because the idea is thinking about this more architecturally. Because human in the loop as a phrase kind of suggests the situation where you're going to define a system, you're going to build it, you're going to do whatever, and then you will later figure out where does the person go. It's kind of like pin the tail on the donkey. Yes, okay, I've got the architectural chart. I guess I'll pop them in there. And that's a mistake. And we really need to be able to define something that keeps the human in that main part of it from the get-go, with all their constraints, with everything that they need to do. All right. An example then. What does this look like in practice? Yeah, I'll pick co-work, because I think it does actually a pretty good idea. You give it a task like, generate a presentation from these papers and articles. And it's actually going to ask you things. Well, who's this for? What's it going to do? It kind of forces my own mind into this one. How long should it be? What aspects do you most focus on? It doesn't just go off and do it. It comes up with a plan, and it makes me take part in the plan. It actually keeps me involved in that. And I have to kind of clear it at every point. Now, the problem with that is you don't really want systems that require you to keep on answering yes or no at every single stage, because let's face it, that's what kind of already we see jokes about this with Claude Code, and the fact that we could replace our keyboard with just allow, and you just start going numb to this stuff. We don't want that, but we do want something that keeps us involved. And when I say we want, it's going to be a need more than anything. I'm making a reference here to the European Union's AI Act, which if you're starting to do this, got a little note here. Any high-risk AI system, things that involve finance, things that involve job opportunities, must be designed and developed in such a way that they can be effectively overseen by natural persons. And there's a tricky word for me. Not just overseen, but effectively overseen. We're going to have to start building this stuff in to the applications to make sure that that stuff actually works. Now, the thing about this is, people often focus on the cost of this. We all know We all know the ridiculous power requirements of this stuff. We all know the hundreds of millions of dollars it takes to train the frontier models. We all know the fact that token burn is a thing and we've got tons of expense. But people, I think, often get caught up in the idea that, yes, AI itself is expensive, but the cost of experimenting is not. The cost of experimenting is trivial. It's almost zero. It's a few dollars. It's a few minutes to find out if anything works or not. And there's kind of this rule, I think most people in general should be trying these more, rather than approaching them as if they're kind of enterprise software purchases that we have to do research on and evaluations. I know, just try them. They're super easy. You rarely get locked into this stuff. Yes, we stay aware of the cost of this stuff. I love the quote from the Wall Street Journal. Using AI to summarize an email is like getting a Lamborghini to deliver a pizza. There's a good point to that. It is brutal. We're not seeing the full actually impact of these costs yet. But still, working with new tools, trying them out, experimenting with them is by itself trivial. It's almost zero. People should be doing a lot more of that. But if I'm going to say, talking about this kind of idea of shifting your own ability working with AI to be a bit more goal-directed, I'm going to kind of pick a point, many software developers in the room, of, you remember rubber duck prototyping or rubber ducking? This might sound absurd, but there is actually a thing, rubber duck debugging. It's kind of fallen out of fashion in the last few years, but it was a thing for a while. It was originally in the Pragmatic Programmer book back in the 90s. It even got to a point where Stack Overflow on April Fool's Day would do Quack Overflow. The idea, ridiculously, is that if you're trying to debug something and you're stuck and you can't figure out how to explain it, you go through your code line by line and you explain it to the duck. I know this sounds absurd. It actually works. You literally go, well, this line is doing this, and then the next line is doing that. And then you typically hit a point where you go, and the next line, oh, hang on. And you realize, by explaining it to this little Zen-like figure, it actually kind of reveals something about it. And I think this model is actually useful for people in AI. If you're trying to talk to AI, if you're trying to get better at describing goals and not processes, talk to the duck. Try and explain this as if you would to a human who doesn't know it. If you prefer, imagine, and I know it's a cliched analogy, imagine talking to an intern. How would you describe this to an intern? Not the full process, you must pick this up and move this over here, but what do I want? What's actually important about this? Can you define what done looks like? Now, one of the bits of pushback I'll get from people when we do this is, I've tried handing over some of my tasks to AI, and it keeps getting things wrong. And this was broken, and that was broken. It didn't do exactly what I wanted. I wanted an image, and the person has 7 fingers. I wanted some code, and the code didn't compile. I wanted some results and summaries of a legal case, and it hallucinated the results. Yes, totally get it. It happens. The thing is, I'm actually not that bothered when AI gets something wrong, and I think part of it is because of my own history. So I used to teach corporate training, mostly teaching developers and software folks who were already experienced, and teaching them how to work with a new language or framework or some new tool. What that basically means is you get a lot of people getting stuff wrong. And they try and write code, and it doesn't work. And as a teacher, you kind of end up looking at it, you sit down, sit beside them, look at it and go, you're fine. You go, yes, this doesn't work, it's broken, but you just missed a couple of things. You fundamentally got this, it's just a couple of things you need to tweak before you get it, but I am not worried about it. I am not worried about you being able to get it. And that's the vibe I typically get from code now. If I'm looking at the results from, let's say, Cloud Code or anything, even when it gets something wrong, I look at it and go, yeah, you're fine, just a little tweak, we're good. It's this sense of, no, it's absolutely getting there. But that's the flip side from, I can think of some fairly kind of, let's say, cranky graybeards that I know in my life who will tell AI to do something with code. And when it gets it wrong, they're almost triumphant. It becomes this, look, you see, it messed up. It got it wrong. It's useless. it's not actually useless. It just didn't get it all the way there, but it's getting there. I think having this kind of lens of teaching, having the ability to actually look at a problem that AI gives you and go, what kind of wrong is this? Because it's not A level wrong, it's just a little bit wrong. It's a little bit wrong down there. And this stuff becomes incredibly useful. And I think it's an important perspective to have. And you can make your own kind of goals about what is actually a good way to measure some of the results of AI. Folks who know Simon Willison might know he's got this little test that he's been doing on and off for years, which is basically, I'm going to feed this prompt to an AI generator. I want a pelican riding a bicycle. And he's been doing this for years now. And it sounds trivial, but the goal is, how am I going to pass this prompt to an AI, and what level of understanding is the AI going to do? So for example, if something's riding a bicycle, then the flipper should reach the pedals. Yeah, it's doing pretty good. That's pretty good on this one, but this particular example, the leg, one of those legs should be obscured by the crossbar, but it's not. Sometimes it is, in some certain models it is. Other times the flippers don't reach the pedals. This time some spokes are missing. So how is it starting to represent this? There's some other examples. Ethan Mollick, for those of you who know him, his go-to choice was, I want an otter or a plane using Wi-Fi. Again, going from kind of absurd 2022 to, yeah, I mean, pretty good. I have my own simple example that I'll pick quite a bit, and I like using Midjourney for this. I'm not bothered about the rest of the models. I use Midjourney because you can actually choose the model still in the interface. You can actually go in, enter a prompt, and select, go back to version 1 from 2022. So let's say I do a prompt like, I want a photo, standing shot of a middle-aged professor, highly educated European woman with medium hair, length hair, glasses, confident, smiling, holding a violin. Background is Parisian cafe. That's Midjourney version 1, the model from just 4 years ago. Now at the time, we just thought it was remarkable that you could do any of this at all. It's like, well, you obviously wouldn't use it, but it's, you know, it's, okay, it's kind of getting there. You fast forward a few years, this is Midjourney V7 with exactly the same prompt. And you pretty much look at it and go, yeah, it's fine. It's absolutely fine. It's completely usable. And I actually don't know when the tipping point happened for me. It's probably somewhere around version 5, version 6. Where generally speaking, like, yeah, it's usable. Now the thing is, I wouldn't even say if somebody said, well, I used Midjourney and gave me a wrong result. Yeah, absolutely. I believe you. You can still get weird text, weird fingers, weird bodily positions, but still the general experience of working with it has flipped or tipped for most people to not perfect, but entirely usable. And that's happened again with, I mean, for me, even in the last, I'm going to say the last 6 months with the coding tools. I probably was a bit of a reactionary back to, yeah, I mean, the Copilot's great, Claude Code is great, and they're all fantastic, but obviously you have to kind of take everything and get the human review. And now I'm much more inclined to lean to, it's fine, it's just doing it, and you can automate as much of it as possible. Let's say, I'm aware there's a few companies these days that are famously kind of having some coding standards where they say code should not be written by humans and code should not be reviewed by humans. A year ago, I would have said that's ridiculous, I think that's stupid, of course you have to do it. These days, I'm much more inclined to go, yeah, the job has changed. It's not, your job as a programmer is not to write code. Your job is to deliver code that works. However that happens, whether you actually wrote that code or whether you actually read it, is kind of becoming immaterial. So, to summarize, we want to get a little bit better with this. I don't believe it is about knowing more about backpropagation or gradient descent or how the algorithms work. That is very important stuff for a very small section of the community. It is to focus on describing goals, not steps, describing what we want rather than how that should be done. Trying to come up with things that you couldn't do before rather than just automating the process that you do. I think it's a major goal to try and be surprised and recognize that if you're not being surprised by AI on a weekly basis, you're probably being a bit too prescriptive. keeping the human in the lead, trying to maintain that slightly tolerant viewpoint that yes, AI will get stuff wrong, it can still be okay and it can still be useful, and once in a while, explaining your goals to the day. Thank you for listening on this Sunday afternoon. Have a little bit of peace. Program. It's like an application, it's like this. And there's a much less understanding that you don't just have kind of these agents out there. You also need to get people working on the idea of agentic behavior. Just, no, I'm going to describe a goal to the AI. And a little sidebar on that. I got to think if I was back here a year or two, we're not going to say the word agentic anymore. It's just going to be what we expect these things to do. But the goal of that, which is fundamentally, you can think of some of this as being the equivalent of a full-length conversation with a chatbot. Still, you can have that idea of where does this conversation begin and how much does the person have to drive? And one of the references I made very early on at the start of that talk is I like crafting situations where the AI gives me something where I almost get an emotional, oh, no, response to. The real danger of a lot of these agentic systems, and it's not the technology, it's the way people are doing it, is, let's say I'm building a system that is going to create, could be anything, could be 50 replies to customer emails, or 50 pages of documentation for a new course, or a whole bunch of new branding information. If I have the AI agent at that point do all this research and do all the work, and kind of wait to the end of it, to then come up with 50 pages and hand that to a person, the person is probably going to go look at 2 pages of it and go, it's fine, and it becomes this kind of rubber stamp idea. So the idea of human in the lead becomes, how can you actually design a system that stops at these points and says, no, we're not going to wait till we get there. We're going to make sure that the person has to give us a response earlier on. They have to actually go, well, here's the elevator pitch, here's the one paragraph, and you can say yes, no. Even if I maybe give you a 4-up display, kind of like Midjourney, I'm going to give you 4 versions of this, and you need to pick one. So how can I introduce kind of speed bumps into the process that encourage the human being to stay involved with it, rather than how do I build a system that once in a while takes a person and goes, pretty much that'll do it. And I think that's a big part of it. And that is the design of the system, nothing to do with the AI.
Thank you. Please, come on, Barry. How's it going, man? Thanks for that. That was really great. I've got a question about the human in the lead stuff as well. I mean, the way that I see you characterizing what it is to be human in the lead is something akin to a creative director. Right. So, the thing about creative directors is that they're really, if they're good anyway, they're smart, they have an understanding for what was on the ground. They became a creative director by going through all the stuff that led them to see all the mistakes a lot. So it seems to me like, I think you're absolutely right about, pretty much everything that you said. I'm just wondering how you think about the talent, the creative director pipeline.
Right.
Because I don't understand, I know how you and I, who have been around, we've seen all the things about that, so we know how to creative direct, creatively direct, but there's a whole generation where, it's like a newbie movie director. What are they gonna do? They don't know anything. They haven't made 1,000 mistakes. Anyway, you get what do you think?
And I do, and I have to be careful because there's almost a cliche at the moment of people talking about taste is still important. And I really think it's true, but it almost feels like I'm flaunting the answer. Oh, well, we're going to be fine. Taste is great. But I do think it's important. That's the part that AI is never going to do. AI doesn't have an opinion on something. It can do probabilistic recognition, but it doesn't actually have an opinion of this is good and this is bad. Whether that's the design of something or the construction of a course or, again, as someone who's very involved in education, AI can never do something like say, I find this really boring. It's never going to say it finds something boring. It doesn't find anything boring or exciting or tedious or whatever it is. And first is it is that recognizing that those emotional responses are actually useful in a way that AI isn't going to replicate. It might be able to fake it at some point. It isn't going to do. And to your other point, that I would admit is the one thing that, and again, it's a bit of a cliche, absolutely worries me right now, which is how do we get younger folks up to this? I used to, again, I've been involved in this field for ages. It used to be, a conversation I would regularly have with somebody saying, hey, my kid's 16, they're thinking of getting into programming, and have a quick conversation. Sure, absolutely. That happened multiple times. And these days, I see the way the market's doing, where there's a lot of people are just shutting down the junior roles. Nobody's bringing it in because AI can do that. And I don't know where the hell that's going.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that's going to be like in a few years. And it's genuinely difficult for me to engage with that. I'd like to think that people are going to turn that around, but it really is the case of I don't know anymore how people do that kind of apprenticeship level, and how do you start to develop that if you don't understand it. And that's probably the few points of this where I'm going to say I don't have an answer on it, because it absolutely worries me down.
I would just add that the taste thing is true to some extent, let's suppose, but taste isn't either there or not, because I think that's cultivated. And we're lacking the cultivation pipeline. I was hoping you know the answer to that or the answer either.
Yeah, I don't have an answer yet.
Thanks.
I'm super grateful that you came. I have one quick question. I really like the slide you brought up before, which is sort of dog practice of like how many options you have. Are there any people that you like right now, especially coming out of China, like you're trying to things or?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I look at what a lot of the Chinese companies do with a fair amount of admiration in terms of the speed of execution that they're working at. Kiwi's very impressive. The video generation stuff is kind of, I tip my hat to it. There's some great stuff. There's no particular one on that. All I try and do is stay reasonably involved. And part of that is a bias on that. And unfortunately for the position I'm in, I'm generally focused on, let's say, I'm making content related to OpenAI or Anthropic or Gemini or Copilot. And so I'm kind of looking at those with interest, but not yet getting deep into them. So I stay aware of what they're doing, but that's the most I can do. I'm sure, like everybody else, was I trying to install DeepSeek on my Mac Mini a year ago and being very impressed with what they've done. Totally. I find, and this is going to probably sound a bit mean-spirited, I find kind of some of the news stories about what they're doing, like recently, Anthropic, I think are genuinely one of the better companies dealing with this stuff. And, they're realizing that people are trying to kind of distill their models by getting, creating 50,000 user accounts and basically trying to pull what the models are doing. And how terrible that is. You kind of can't help but thinking, but your own LLMs are kind of based on ripping off a whole bunch of stuff you never asked permission for in the first place. So I'm not sure that's a really great leg you have to stand on. But yes, the technologies are very impressive. I played a little bit with Kimi, I haven't done too much with it. And I've forgotten the spacing on the name of the recent video model that was. So that's a non-answer, I'm afraid. But yeah, I look at what they're doing, and that's why I don't have a particular role. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.